Hello, my name is Yassine Sharif, and today my oral presentation is going to be on the global biodiversity crisis that is currently surrounding reptiles and amphibians today. All right, let's go ahead and define what a reptile is. So, reptiles belong to the reptilia class, and that is a vertebrate animal that includes snakes, lizards, turtles, crocodiles, and alligators. And in the bottom right, that is going to be called the tuatura, which is a reptile of a lesser known species, but nonetheless, it is a reptile. And they generally have dry, scaly skin and are cold blooded. Next, let's go ahead and define what an amphibian is. So, amphibians belong to the amphibia class, and they include things like frogs, toads, salamanders, newts, and in the bottom right over there, what looks like a snake, but is actually called the caecilian, which is also a species of its own distinct lineage, but nonetheless, it is an amphibian. And they tend to be more aquatic animals than reptiles, but are also cold blooded and they do survive on land. Let's go ahead and define biodiversity. So, biodiversity, according to Merriam Webster, is defined as biological diversity in an environment as indicated by numbers of different species of plants and animals. So, what that means that the higher levels of biodiversity in an ecosystem, it's going to be more species in that ecosystem. And then, of course, the lower it's going to be less species of species in an ecosystem. So it's better, of course, to have the higher biodiversity levels because it allows for genetic diversity and it allows for species of more unique kind. So why is biodiversity important and why should we care? So similar to markets in an economy, species in an ecosystem all play a role, and they all have an important role no matter how small or big they are. Just because they may seem more significant or less significant than one other species doesn't mean that they are not important, of course. And healthy biodiversity levels allow for ecosystems, of course, that are full of unique species. They keep populations of invasive species low, and they allow for genetic diversity on Earth, whether that means genetic diversity in the next couple of years or the next 1,000 years. It is better to have high biodiversity because it means that more species will be living amongst each other and interacting with each other. So, what is the crisis and what's currently happening? So, currently, reptiles and amphibians are experiencing a historic decline in population all over the globe. And I have put some photos of some popular endangered animals. Starting from the left, that's the leatherback sea turtle. Uh, in the middle is going to be the gharial, which is a family of a crocodile. And on the very right is the Chinese giant salamander. And all of these species, what they have in common is that their populations have gone down so significantly in the past several decades that they run the risk of extinction. And according to the IUCN, which is the International Union for Conservation of Nature, uh, they estimate that there are about 382 reptile species that are endangered, and that is as of 2016. And that number is going to be more than double for amphibians at 848. And this is just the species that they are aware about because reptiles are so small and there's so many of different reptiles and amphibian species. It's hard to keep count of every single species. So this is only the ones that researchers are aware about. So it could be more or less. All right, let's go ahead next. And this is going to be a graph of endangered species on Earth compiled by the IUCN. And this is the red list. So this is the most endangered of endangered species. And the dark brown bar is going to be reptile species, and the yellow bar is going to be amphibians. And this is from 2007 to 2019. As you can tell, the red bar more than tripled in size. So reptile species more than tripled in size of endangered species, which is, of course, is alarming for both researchers and the conscious citizen. And for amphibians, it looks like they started off relatively. They had many species that have been endangered, but with time, that number did not seem to get smaller. It only seemed to have gotten slightly bigger. And the total red list from 2007 to 2019 has almost doubled in size, which is depressing to see, especially since human activity is so supposed to be so regulated nowadays. Obviously, it's not, as we can tell by these graphs. So, what are the causes for the declining populations? So, the biggest one, of course, is habitat destruction, and that's mostly due to human activity and development. And we can see that especially in the pictures right over here on the right. It's a little lake right here, and then in the back is a refinery. And what happens, what's the common case, is that these refineries and human developments, they pollution gets into the habitats of these amphibians and reptiles, and stuff like water seepage gets into their lakes and rivers, which damages the habitats and diseases the amphibians and reptiles in the area, which essentially ruins the population and genetic biodiversity over time. And that leads me, yes, to environmental population. Environmental pollution. And as you can tell, it's just depressing to see how unregulated things like this are, especially in the US, which it does occur often. Disease is also a big one, and this is usually due to pesticides that are unregulated by the government. This mostly occurs in places of third world countries usually have this issue because they use pesticides on crops and plants without knowing that it does in fact kill and damage the populations of reptiles and amphibians, just because they don't have the research there to support it. And climate change, of course, is a very big issue for these reptiles and amphibians because it leads to a decline in water and food resources for the amphibians and reptiles, which essentially kills them and allows them not to reproduce at the rate they should be reproducing. So, what is the effect of their declining populations on an ecosystem? So, of course, we do know that each species is important in their ecosystem, no matter how big or small. And reptiles and amphibians tend to be of smaller size. And like I said before, these reptiles and amphibians, they do keep control of pests in the area. So in the bottom right, you can see the snake eating a mouse. Snakes are responsible for keeping rodent populations down and essentially regulating the populations so that stuff like farmers don't have too many rodents eating their crops and things like that affect humans. And then, of course, lizards and frogs do eat insects, which keep insect populations regulated and sustainable so that they do not become too large. So how are we as humans combating declining populations of reptiles and amphibians? The U.S. Endangered Species Act, which was implemented by Congress in 1973 and signed into law by President Nixon, has been in effect for over 50 years, or nearly 50 years. I'm sorry, and it protects these animals from things like poaching and environmental damage through regulation of like building and human activities, stuff like that. And it was vital for keeping endangered animals basically aware to the public and aware to researchers so that we can find solutions to these issues. And activist groups play a big role in conserving populations of reptiles and amphibians. One of the biggest being PARC, which is Partners in Amphibian and Reptile Conservation, which do things like facilitate zoo programs for repopulation and spread awareness about things like declining population and habitat damage caused by humans. US ARC is also a very big activist group responsible for recovering reptile populations on Earth. US mostly. And finally, it's important to know that, of course, there is still hope for these species, and we're not at a point where we can essentially give up, but we should be aware that we are dangerously coming close to that point, and that we need to be fully aware and invested in helping these reptile and amphibian populations recover and get to a point that is healthy and sustainable. Thank you for listening.